All right. Hi, good morning. This is my first in-person presentation in about a year, so that's kind of exciting for me. Anyway, my name is Kat Castle. I am the CSU Small Acreage Specialist for the Front Range region, and I realized in practicing this presentation last night, I forgot to put I am a joint position with the NRCS, so I can help with both NRCS programs and just general education from CSU, all surrounding small acreage. I also forgot to put my email address on this presentation, so it's just my name, kat.caswell@colostate.edu. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about managing grazing in your small-scale pastures or on your small acreages. And this whole day has been really fun for me because I did do my master's in weed science, so I'm always excited to hear more about weeds and weed management. So grazing can be a really, really great tool when it comes to weed management. It can both harm you and it can help you. So we have this picture on the left, which was in a cornfield that was planted to cover crops. We didn't quite get the grazing timing a little right, and we had plenty of horseweed come up and be a bit of a problem for this guy. But we can also have some really, really great management, like these cattle on the right. This is actually a rangeland picture from eastern Colorado. And these guys had fantastic rotational grazing. They knew when to target their grazing to control weeds, and they could stockpile their grasses and had some really great forage all the way into the early winter. So we can't talk about grazing management or much in Colorado without talking about drought conditions. So I pulled this down from the U.S. Drought Monitor just on Wednesday. So we're still sitting in some pretty extreme drought across the state. Some of it's been mitigated in the northern Front Range, but across the state, we're largely still looking at a deficit. So this is a hydrological drought. It's not necessarily what we call an agricultural drought, so we'll still see effects on plants this coming spring. And we do have the possibility of moving further into drier conditions throughout the spring, depending on what moisture we get coming up. So we could get more, we could get less. So a lot of times when I'm talking about grasses with landowners, just keep in the back of your mind that we could hit another drought, and what is your contingency plan if we do hit that drought? So why even bother managing grazing? Well, one, it improves the health of your grass. It improves the productivity of your grass. And because that grass is healthy and growing, it can really resist weeds. And that kind of goes back to your integrated pest management strategies. If you have competitive grasses that are doing really well, you can outcompete those weeds moving in. And it's a lot easier to spot when you do have infestations moving in, and you can spot treat them and control them a lot sooner. Also, it's just good land management and good land stewardship. It can improve water quality, reduce erosion. It looks nicer, if you ask me, to be looking at a grass field than just some dirt blowing around. So overall, it's going to help you. So these are some of the questions that I always ask landowners or producers whenever I meet with them first when they want to talk about grazing. For one, do you have animals? Do you plan on grazing those animals? How many do you have and what type? So how we're going to graze a sheep is going to be a bit different than how we're going to graze a cow versus how we graze a horse. And if you're planning animals, how many animals do you intend to get? Are you trying to do enough that you have enough meat to put in the freezer, or are they just for fun so the kids have a pet sheep? Or whatever you want. In Colorado, we always need to think about our water source. Do you have irrigation? Do you have water rights? Do you have a holding pond? Do you have ditch shares? Or are you relying on rainfall? Are you going to be dry land? Are you going to just hope that we get enough moisture that you get some extra grazing that year? Think about what your current pasture conditions are. Do you want to improve them? Do you want to maintain them? And that's going to dictate kind of your starting point. And then what resources do you have? We like to think of these really big, awesome, cool plans, but maybe they take a bit more time than what we really have. Some guys are retired, so you can go out and spend all day working on your property. Sometimes you're weekend warriors, and you need to come up with a strategy that you can get done on a couple of weekends every month. Also, do you have a budget? And with that budget, do you have access to equipment, or do you have to rent or buy equipment? And then we always want to talk about expectations. So we have a lot of people moving into Colorado from other areas of the country. I mean, myself included. I'm a proud Penn State Nittany Lion. So what I first thought of as what a pasture should look like in Pennsylvania looks a lot different than what a healthy pasture looks like in Colorado. So kind of think of what your long-term goal is and what you really want that pasture to look like at the end of the day. So my training is in agronomy, so I always kind of think, all right, what's the crop we're managing in this field this year? Well, for your pasture, it's your grasses. It's those pasture plants. And sometimes there might be legumes and forms mixed in there, but we're really going to be talking about grasses. So just some really quick physiology of grasses. We have the stem, and that's made up of your nodes and your internodes, the leaf blades, and that's what we typically think of as the leaf, and that's going to be the part that's doing most of the photosynthesis. That was a struggle today. And then finally, we have that seed head. So that will be like the flower of the grass. And when we're trying to tell grasses apart from one another, a lot of time the species differences come down to small details on that collar region, so where the leaf actually meets the stem, or on the seed head of the plant. So sometimes those little collar regions are very, very small and difficult to tell apart. So if you're really struggling to identify a grass, it is typically easier to wait until that grass has a seed head on it and we can distinguish between multiple species. So if we're going to be talking about growing our grass well, we can talk about how grass grows. We want to talk about the growing points. So this point is the location where there's actually new tissue growing on the plants. So we call that the meristematic tissue, and that's where the cells are actively dividing. So the initial growing points will be at the soil surface or just below the soil surface. So if we get a late frost, as long as those growing points are still protected by the soil, a lot of times that grass will survive and continue to grow. And then slowly over time, this growing point will move further up. So think about a pointer that you would extend, right? This is how the growing point moves up. So the youngest leaves are at the top, the oldest leaves are at the bottom. And a corn plant was just a big grass plant. So think about how those bottom leaves on the corn plant die down first. They're typically the oldest and they lose light first. We also want to think about the different species in our field. When we're managing a pasture, we want to manage it as a whole pasture, not necessarily section by section. So we want to find two species that predominantly make up the entirety of our pasture and that complement each other. And different species can be grazed at different heights. So some species like crested wheatgrass, Kentucky bluegrass can be grazed at 4 to 6 inches and then be grazed down to around 2 or 3 inches. So kind of going with the principle of take half, leave half. But we do have a lot of our species that are really common, like different bromes and orchard grasses, that have to wait until they're about 6 or 8 inches, and then you don't want to graze them below 4 inches. So this is why it's important to know what is actually making up your pasture and how to best manage that. So it's really always important to remember when we're talking about our pasture plants that we need to leave enough leaf surface there that we can continue photosynthesis and those leaves can continue to make carbs and energy and food for the plant. If we graze all those leaf blades off and leave just a stem, it's unlikely that plant will be able to recover as well as it would have otherwise. The same thing goes with the growing points. If we graze too low, too often, and continually damage that growing point, it's less likely those plants will come back, and they might slowly disappear out of the pasture. And then really quick, because there's always livestock involved in this, we want to think about the nutrient content and when the ideal time for grazing is. When the plant is kind of early in its growth stage, early in the spring, so what a lot of our grasses look like right now, it's mostly vegetative. It's like that A picture that's really high nutritional quality. In that B picture, that grass is almost about to send out a seed head. We call this the boot stage. There's slightly more stem in that stem to leaf ratio, so it's a little bit lower nutritional quality, but it's a really good grazing time. And then there's picture C. And this is when the plant has completely had a seed head emerge. Oftentimes, for some of our grass species, we want to wait until this point, either B or C, for hay, because we can get the optimal amount of tonnage from it. And there's some species that do best when we graze them at the seed level. But in general, at this point, with the amount of stem that's on the plants, it's more fibrous and thus making it less palatable and slightly less nutritional content for the animals. So I typically try to graze around that B, somewhere in between B and C level. It's also important to think about plant roots. This is where plants are pulling nutrients from. They get their nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus from the soil. So we need to make sure that we're not grazing our plants so heavily that we deplete this root system. And it's important to remember that the plant has to regenerate 30% of its root system each year, in addition to expanding its roots so it can grow even larger. So just keep that in mind, that we want to make sure we're keeping our root systems healthy as well. And a lot of the times these big root systems can then get deeper into the soil and access additional moisture. So when we're grazing, we again want to keep thinking about that root system. Now, if we look at that smallest plant all the way on the end, that is a continuously grazed plant that has not had any rest allowed for it. And if you think about it going from the largest plant to the smallest plant there, that would be if we continuously grazed it, we're constantly knocking that plant back, we're not allowing it to regrow, we're not giving it a chance to recover that root system, we're going to slowly over time just decrease that plant's ability to survive, and it might move out of the pasture completely. That largest plant would have been under a management strategy that was more of a rotational grazing or mob grazing, where we graze it quickly, we get it down just to the height we want, and then we give it the full-time amount of recovery that it needs in order to regrow to a healthy grazing level. Again, we want to think about how the plants grow. So we have cool season and warm season grasses. Cool season grasses prefer cooler temperatures. So this is like Kentucky bluegrass or orchard grass. They come up earlier in the spring. They typically peak somewhere early summer, May, June, and then they hit the summer slump. So they're still green and growing, but they won't be growing as quickly. They'll just kind of slow down. Some might go semi-dormant, and then they might have another little flush again in the fall, and you might be able to get some second grazing off of them. Maybe, if we have enough moisture. We live in Colorado, it's all moisture dependent. Warm season grasses are just the inverse of cool season grasses. So they emerge later in the summer, they peak June, July, August, and then they drop off pretty quickly and turn brown. So think something like a green sorghum or corn is just our kind of most obvious examples of a warm season grass. So you bought a property and you're really excited and you want to get some animals out there and you're kind of thinking, how many animals can I actually fit on this property? Well, one, you're going to need to check your zoning regulations first and foremost, but your zoning will dictate the maximum amount of animals you can have, but that doesn't mean that's the amount of animals you can sustainably keep on that property. So a lot of times the amount of forage that's there, if we plan on getting all of our animals feed from our pastures, that amount of forage is going to vary by season to season. If we're in a drought, if we're in a wet year, if we've had a really cold spring, maybe things won't grow as quickly in the spring. If we have water availability, and then just the forage type that's even out there, along with what the animal needs. So a young growing animal might need more feed than an older animal. Are they skinny and you're trying to bulk them up? Are they heavily used animals if you're using them for leisure or exercise? And then if the animal is pregnant or not. So there's just a lot of variations that are going to go into how much you can actually get off that ground. So a really good example of this is just thinking if you need to feed your animal 30 pounds of forage a day. So that means you'll need around 11,000 pounds a year. And you have just one pasture that's 1 acre. And you know that pasture produces around 900 pounds of forage per year. And that's pretty common for a dryland pasture. In Colorado, it will typically produce just under a ton. And then we're going to assume that there's only 30% utilization of the grass that's actually there. This might seem really low, but this is kind of our baseline. We can either move that utilization percentage up or down based on management strategies, but a lot of our forage is lost just to things like animals walking on it, if there's leaf area left over from old grazing, manure standing out there. We lose a good bit to wildlife. In Loveland, there's an elk herd that grazes up and down one of the valleys. They'll take off grass as well. So, okay, we've got our 900 pounds. We assume 30% utilization. That means there's only 270 pounds of usable forage from that 1 acre a year. If we need to feed our animal 30 pounds a day, that means we only have 9 days of grazing from that one pasture a year. So if we're going to meet the full needs of that animal, we'll need 41 acres to feed that animal solely on grazed forage a year. And 41 acres, if you live on the Front Range, it's kind of a big property, just for one animal. So a lot of times, if you're planning on keeping especially horses, unless you have irrigation and you can encourage regrowth faster by irrigating, you're going to assume that you're going to need to either buy all or the vast majority of your feed. And then use pastures more as light grazing and turnout areas. So you don't want to graze those pastures until they're at least 6 to 8 inches tall, and then not graze them for more than 7 to 10 days in an area. And that length is really going to depend on the forage and the quality and the amount you have that year. So a good kind of strategy is to feed your animals before you turn them out. So feed them in a dry lot, in the barn, whatever resource you have, so that way they're kind of full and satiated and less likely to go out there and dive towards that candy bowl in the pasture. And then consider, if you're planting a new species or a new pasture area, using something with a little bit lower palatability but has high traffic resistance. So it can handle animals walking on it frequently or maybe riding on it frequently, but it's less likely that the animals are really going to want to eat that. So we always want to think like, I'm one of those people who as soon as it hits spring, I want to get outside. I want to see animals out in the pasture, beautiful frolicking chickens, what have you. But you can't really ask, are my animals ready to get out of the barn? Am I ready to get them out of the barn? You really have to go based on your grass. You need to ask, is my grass actually ready? Has it hit that 6 to 8 inches tall? So a lot of our strategies really need to be based off of our grass conditions. So we see a good amount of overgrazing occur from either leaving stock on the pasture for too long, so we leave those 4 cows out on the pasture for 3 months straight, or we bring them back too soon. So we take them off the pasture, we let it regrow, but we don't let it regrow long enough, and we put animals back on, and we ding up that pasture pretty badly. So we want to think about these 2 pictures are a great example of stocking density versus stocking rate. So both of these pastures have the same stocking rate. They both have 100 animal days per acre, right? But that first picture has a very low stocking density. There's just that one animal on 100 days for grazing. It's more likely that animal is going to kind of cherry pick what it likes out of the field. It'll go through and it'll munch on just whatever it thinks is best. And then rather than eating the things it doesn't like, it's going to go back to the new growth and hammer those new growing plants that it liked before. It's going to eat them again. This is a lot of times when we start seeing overgrazing from understocking. That second picture with all those tiny cows in there is 100 animals for one day. So this will be more of a mob grazing or high stocking density. So that will have much more uniform grazing across the entire field. Those animals will be forced to consume what's around them. They can't really pick so much. And then we get them off the next day and allow that pasture to completely regrow. So those 2 will have different effects. They could both hurt you and harm you depending on your management. It's important to actually know what height your grass is at. Take a ruler. You can't do it from the dashboard. You can't do it from the window of the house. You need to go out and walk your pastures and have an idea of where that grass actually is and how well your management's working. So remember to always look behind. What rest period did my pastures need and what did I actually give them? And then look ahead, say, all right, I want to turn them out in 2 weeks, but has this pasture actually had enough time yet? So I'm going to have to come back and check again. And then look at where your livestock is right now. Are you at a good stocking rate? You can make adjustments throughout the year. If the cattle are moving through that pasture 3 days faster than you thought they would, you can adjust the time you move them, or you can give them extra space. It's completely flexible, and you need to find the system that really works best for you. So from this image, if you're going to think about what your monitorings tell you, this would look like a pretty obvious moment of understocking and overgrazing to me. There's lots of really short grasses and then clumps of really tall grasses. So you might see those overgrazed grasses that the horses obviously really like slowly move out of our pasture over time and give a chance for weeds to move in, like we're looking at in this picture. There's some really just open spaces. The conservationist in me is just seeing soil erosion possibilities, but also the weed scientist is saying, oh, there's a lot of empty space for some weeds to move in here. You might start getting some thistles. So having grass there will give less of an opportunity for those weeds to move in. Or maybe you're looking back and saying, hey, I've got some nice grass on this side of the fence. That rotational grazing is working pretty well for me. And maybe on the other side, it hasn't been working so well. Maybe you left the animals out a little bit too long during drought. So look back, take a stock of what you're doing, and then make adjustments to meet your future needs. So there's some really great key strategies we want to think about when managing our pastures. One, you can always subdivide pastures. You can do it with temporary electric fencing. You can do it with permanent fencing. There's a lot of options for this. You can also create a sacrifice area, and I think these are fantastic. It's a great place to put your animals when we have really heavy rains, and you don't want them out there chewing up the dirt and causing rips and damage to your pasture. It's also really great when we have extreme droughts, and we need to take animals off the pasture to protect it just from damage during drought. So having an area that your animals can be safe and dry, and you can easily feed them, and access to water, of course. So when we're subdividing pastures, always consider the layout, how you're going to get the animals there. Do you have to haul water, or do they have water access out there? What type of fencing you're going to choose? How much upfront cost is this going to be? How quickly can you do this? How quickly can you move the animals? Do you need to make a system that you can get out there and move them before you go to work? Or is it okay if you kind of have a more slow approach to it? And then how can you utilize your existing facilities? Use what you've already got to your best advantage. And then how good that forage is actually looking out there. I'm a big fan of temporary electric fencing. I love these plastic white step-in posts. They're pretty easy to get in the ground when the ground is soft. When it's harder, you kind of have to find a crack and stomp them in a little bit, but they're very easy to set up and a pretty low learning curve to get used to them. And then there's different types of poly tape and poly wires. If you have horses, the poly tape is probably your better bet. Poly wires work very well with cattle and pigs. If you intend to do goat, sheep, or chickens, I would really recommend using the poly wire netting. It's a bit of a pain to get used to setting it up and how to take it down without it turning into a jumbled mess. But once you kind of get the hang of it, it's fantastic. Works like a charm. Solar chargers are not wildly expensive. You can get chargers that can plug into existing power sources, or just movable solar chargers won't run you more than a couple $100. So this is a really great example of rapid rotational grazing. And around that edge of the green area, you can see that there is some permanent fencing. And then within that permanent fencing, it's been broken down into 6 smaller pastures using just temporary electric fencing. So animals will be able to access those individual paddocks based on what gate you open on the day. So they have that center alleyway that they can move down, and then you can let them into the fresh pasture, move them out at nights, or just open up the next gate the next morning and move them over into the next pasture. That holding area is really great because you have access to water up at the top of that, which means you won't have to haul water out to your pastures. And it also means it's less likely that animals are going to congregate in one corner and apply excessive amount of manure and cause some damage to the grass in one corner. So it makes the management of your pastures a little bit easier. And then here's just an example of a radial pasturing configuration. So I have a cursor, I think. In the center is an existing barn that has a confinement area around it. And then the pasture access is just based on what gate you open that day. And this is another great thing because you can run a lot of your electric fencing right from the barn if you've got power hookups. And again, you've got your extra feed up there and the water access is up there rather than having to run hoses down. So these pastures are actually pretty big. You can further subdivide these if you want, depending on what your forage is like that year. So here's a really great example that was created by my predecessor in this position, actually, who was working with an individual who had moved into the area and bought, I think it was around 5 acres, and was really surprised that she wasn't going to get her full forage grazing for her horses off of her 5 acres in Colorado. So what she did instead was create herself a little paddock paradise, and it works really well, and she was probably really happy with this after the drought. But up at the top of this hill, you can see we have an existing barn. And then she's got an alleyway that runs down the middle, right? So a lot of her water sources, her feeders are all up in this main barn area. And then each day she can move the horses from one paddock to the next just simply by opening a gate and moving them over to the next paddock over, or taking them up to the barn. She's also got an extra gate kind of halfway down the alleyway, so if she needs to completely confine the horses and keep them off the pastures totally, she can do that with relative ease. I've seen sort of similar setups for doing rotational grazing on cornfields with cattle, grazing cover crops, and similar situations with dairy cattle that are moving in and out of the barn because they have to be milked every day. So once you kind of train the animals to this, a lot of times, especially cattle, they can move themselves. If you just open one gate, open the gate they're in, open the gate they're going to, a lot of times they'll just move right to that nice fresh forage. So it's always really important to keep records, keep records, keep records. Take pictures of your successes, take pictures of your failures. I know we don't want to take pictures of our failures. It's kind of sometimes a bad memory, but take pictures of your failures because then you can know how to change and know how to do better. So write down the grazing order of your pastures, when you started grazing, when you stopped grazing, how many animals you put in that pasture for how long they were in that pasture, and then take notes on the general health and productivity. So was it doing super well in the spring and now you've hit that summer slump? Write that down. And then keep track of your seasonal variations in weather. So take notes of what that spring conditions were like or that late fall conditions were like. When managing woods land, I preferred to use I got some really inexpensive little notebooks that could fit in my back pocket, and it was really easy just to whip it out and say, I've got a Canada thistle infestation starting in pasture B, whatever. And then I can look back and date that, take pictures, match it up with my cell phone. That was just the easiest way for me to do it, and it was really easy, especially during the winter when I was trying to figure out what went well and what went poorly and what I can do next spring. It was really easy to have that notebook to look back and see what I was thinking and see what I was seeing at that time. I preferred a notebook. I like writing things down. I've met guys who do it on their cell phones. They record everything in a notes app. Whatever works best for you, do that. Find what works best for you. And then finally, if you can't tell, I previously taught undergraduates, I want to give you a little bit of homework. And it's not very hard homework, and it's enjoyable homework. Go out and actually walk your pastures. Walk and see how they're doing. Do you think they're overgrazed? Do you think they're underutilized? Can you be getting more out of your pastures, or do you need to pull back a little bit? Try to identify the grasses and weeds. CSU Extension is a great resource. You can take them to your local extension office or email a picture to your local extension agent, and then develop a grazing plan. Actually write out what you want to do this year, how you're going to move your animals, how you might subdivide them. Have a plan going into it. Your plans can always be changed really easily. You can make adjustments. You can be adaptive, but it's a lot easier to figure out where you're going if you have a map to get there. And I also forgot to put a conclusion slide on there. So I am more than happy to take any questions you have and share my contact info in the chat.
Thank you very much, Kat. If you have questions for Kat, now is a great time to either raise your hand or place the questions in the chat. I will read them. Here's a question from Karen. What are the concerns with grazing and herbicide use?
Hi, Karen. Well, that is a complicated question. So it will depend on what herbicide you're using. So on your herbicide label, there should be a section that will list what you're using it for. So if you're using it for pasture and rangeland, and then it will have a grazing interval. So there should be a time that says, how many days after you've applied that product can you put animals out to graze? And it'll typically say grazing and haying, so those numbers might vary slightly. A lot of times we can get a lot of really good weed control management from just our grazing strategies and working that way and using animals to control weeds where and when we can. But herbicides can be really effective. We just need to make sure that we're keeping the animals out for that period of time listed on the label.
Great, thank you, Kat. Another question from Janet. How do I develop a grazing plan? Do you have any resources that I can use to help develop a grazing plan?
Yes, we absolutely do, Janet. So if you check out our small acreage management website, it's sam.extension.colostate.edu. If you can tell, I did this presentation last night and realized I completely left off the info slide. So it's sam.extension.colostate.edu. There are a lot of fantastic resources on there that discuss grazing, grazing management, and how to develop pastures, as well as how to measure the amount of forage you currently have in your pasture. Along with that, we do have small acreage management specialists. So I cover the Front Range region. I have a counterpart who covers the southern part of the state, and we are more than happy to visit with you and help you develop that.
Thank you, Kat. Another question from Chris. Could overgrazing occur even if only one animal is eating the grass for a long period of time?
Yes, that is definitely what we call our overgrazing and understocking situation. So a lot of times you'll drive around the Front Range and you'll see two horses in a big old pasture all by themselves, but that pasture looks pretty overgrazed. So what's happening here is that the horses are going around, and any animal can do this. I'm just picking on horses today, I'm sorry. They'll go around and eat the grasses that they like best first. So they'll go around, they might move from one end of the pasture to the other, and then they'll come back to those same grasses. Now, those grasses haven't had enough time to fully regrow. They might only be little tiny new shoots, and those little tiny shoots are actually like candy to livestock. They will go after them because they're lush and green and delicious. So those horses might graze it once, move somewhere else, come back when it's too small, graze that plant again, and that's when we see those plants and grasses being continually grazed and hit and hit and hit, so they don't have time to fully recover. And that's when we see them start to diminish, and we call that overgrazed, just because those grasses aren't able to recover, and we might see those grasses die and then just disappear out of the field.
Great, thank you, Kat. That is all the time we have for questions now. So again, if you have questions, you can email them to Kat or to Jonathan Reif.
Great, thank you.